Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Now, opposite me on Theobald's Road, you can see that green door, well, it's boarded up green, and that is the house where Benjamin Disraeli grew up. He was born here in 1805 into a Sephardi Jewish family because his grandparents had immigrated here from Italy. They were very wealthy from their hat manufacturing business, and his father was able to be a gentleman of leisure who was a very lettered sort of person, and spent most of the time pottering around his library publishing this and that. So Disraeli himself was no mean littérateur either. And he went to a school of no great fame, whereas his two younger brothers both attended Winchester College, went to varsity, don't remember which one, and became perfectly blameless, bland civil servants. So when they were 12, his father had a row with Bevis Mark Synagogue, which is in the city of London, a couple of miles away. I can't remember what this thing was about. They were a disputatious lot, Anglo Jewry, and Isaac Disraeli said, "Right, that's it, we've had it," and stormed out. And so he said, "We're all converted to Christianity." Well, certainly his children were. And they say they converted to the most advantageous type of Christianity in this country at the time, Anglicanism. So at the age of 12, Disraeli and his two younger brothers were baptized into the Church of England. And so this was 1817. Remember, there was still legal discrimination against Protestants outside the Church of England. There was heavier discrimination against Roman Catholics. There were legal disabilities on Jewish people. They were permitted to practice the Judaic faith, but they couldn't attend the universities, they couldn't enter certain professions, and blah, blah, blah. They could not be elected to Parliament because the oath to become an MP or to hold almost any public office required you to swear that you believed in whatever, the supremacy of the Church of England, that the monarch was the head of this, and to attend Anglican worship at least once, and a person of the Judaic faith could not do so in good conscience. Anyway, so Disraeli, he finished his schooling when he was about 18. He hung around his father's library, and he really just idled away his time, achieved almost zilch by the age of 30, besides having an affair with a married woman somewhat older than himself. And he flirted with radicalism, but he decided to be a Tory, joined to one of the two major parties, the other one being the Whigs at the time. It was a time of political transition. The Great Reform Act had just come through. Some people thought in 1832 that the United Kingdom had been in a revolutionary stage, though in fact that was averted. So Disraeli found severe difficulty getting himself elected to Parliament, and his ethnicity was certainly counted against him. And when he addressed one crowd, some of the mob waved bits of bacon at him, shouting, "Would you eat this? Are you really Christian?" and using racial slurs such as Shylock against him. But eventually he was returned to Parliament, and he represented Buckinghamshire. There were 2 MPs for that constituency. So he prospered. Won't go through all the particulars of his way up cursus honorum, but in 1846, Sir Robert Peel, the Tory Prime Minister, announced that he was going to phase out the Corn Laws. That was his sliding scale of taxes on imported corn to keep the price artificially high. Very popular with landowners. If you're producing corn, it made you money. If you're purchasing it, it made you poorer. A stomach tax, a tax on the staff of life, a loaf. So it hit the poorest the hardest. It was regressive. And as they say, the Tory party stood for the landed interest, as in landowners, whereas the Whigs stood for the moneyed interest, as in high finance and industry. And really, the United Kingdom was a mainly industrial country at that time, the first industrialized country in the world. So that was that. So he fulminated against Sir Robert Peel and Peel's disciple, William Ewart Gladstone, and he just tore into them in the purplest of prose, calling them Judas and all the rest of it. And they went off to form the Liberal Party. So Disraeli was one of the more intelligent people in the Tory party, and mostly they were backwoodsmen, buffed and Tufton types who prided themselves on being anti-intellectual. They thought honest, unaffected country types. But Disraeli had to later tacitly admit that actually Peel was right, and the Corn Laws were not going to be brought back, which his party reluctantly accepted. So then he was Prime Minister thrice briefly, but his main period as Prime Minister was 1874 to 1880. And he brought in this Royal Titles Act to make Queen Victoria Empress of India, famously. So she never visited the subcontinent, but she sent out her son, Edward VII, to India, where they held a Durbar near Delhi. And Delhi was not actually the capital at the time, it was Calcutta. But Delhi had previously been the capital. there's some legend that any Indian state which moves its capital to Delhi will soon fall, and so it proved, because the British Raj moved its capital to Delhi officially in 1931 and fell only 16 years later. But anyway, the Durbar can mean palace or various things. So a ceremony where the 500 or so princes of the various Indian states came and abased themselves to Edward VII, did homage to him in behalf of his mother. And that was that. And various things, the Artisans' Dwelling Act, the Food and Drug Act, trying to improve the condition of England, as he said. He was a novelist, he'd written Tancred, Coningsby, Sybil, these various novels where the upper class are supposed to show their paternal concern for the lower orders, charity and philanthropy. The castle is unsafe if the cottage is unhappy, so he said. Now, it was largely bunkum, this neo-medievalism, this idea that the upper class are really actuated by this fatherly concern for the well-being of the lower orders. But anyway, it was seized on by a later generation Conservative politicians, Lord Randolph Churchill, father of Winston, and so on. What else about him? So, yeah, he'd started a march on the Liberals, opposing their attempt at reform as extending the franchise in the 1860s, and then introducing an extension of the right to vote, more radical than the one he'd opposed only the year before. So it was naked opportunism. So that was 1867, the Second Representation of the People Act, or the Second Reform Act, as it's commonly called. There have been several representations of the People Act, so they have to be known by the year. Representation of the People Act, 1832, Representation of the People Act in 1867, right up to 1981. I think it's the most recent iteration of that. So what else about him? He married, however, he was not blessed with children. He was ennobled as Prime Minister as the Earl of Beaconsfield. I know it's spelled Beaconsfield, but it's pronounced Beaconsfield, which is a town in Buckinghamshire. He purchased a estate there and a country house called Hughenden, and indeed that is where he's interred, if I'm not wrong. So people go there. His favourite flower was a primrose. So he was defeated in 1880 after the Midlothian campaign. And Gladstone seemed to have sunk into himself, but in Bulgaria there was a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire put it down with their characteristic savagery, killing insurgents in combat. Nobody could say that's not acceptable in a war, but then killing a huge number of civilians as well. And so Gladstone published a pamphlet, The Bulgarian Horrors and the Question of the East, because British policy was to cozy up to the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was supposed to be the leader of all Mohammedans, and the British Empire was mostly Muslim. So the deal was this: we will be nice to you, the Ottomans, and in return you will tell our Muslim subjects to obey London. And it largely worked. So Gladstone said, no, we must have a moral aspect to our foreign policy, the kind of thing that Blair was to harp on about in the late 90s. Anyway, so this helped win the Liberals that election of 1880. And so he then stood down as leader. He was no longer so prominent, and he died just the next year, 1881. So Gladstone and Disraeli, because there was such a bitter feud between them, they weren't just political rivals, they were different styles, and there was certainly a absolute vitriolic loathing between them. And when Disraeli died and had a huge public funeral, Gladstone said he was too busy to attend, didn't have that common decency. So after him, the Primrose League was founded after his favourite flower, and actually it's since been amalgamated into other conservative organisations. So that's Disraeli. I understand there's mixed feelings about him amongst Anglo Jewry. On the one hand, he was the first and today only Prime Minister of Jewish blood in this country. However, he had crossed the River Jordan, as it were, to become a Christian. He considered Jews to be a very aristocratic people, and he said, I'm the middle page between the Old and the New Testament. So famously, in one of his novels, I think it's Coningsby, about this fictional old Etonian, he had said that yeah, there are two nations in this country, and their habits and manners are as different from each other as the inhabitants of two different planets. And the character says, what are these two nations? He says, the rich and the poor. We live cheek by jowl, we don't really know each other. So here he was on Theobald's Road, and only half a mile ago there would be teeming slums, half a mile away. And so he moved not too far away. Ironically, Lenin lived within half a mile of here. I think it's on Tavistock Street, that away. And he used to quote this line, two nations, about those who live in penury and those who live in the most Elysian opulence. And they live hard by each other, and the wealthy show nary jot of concern for those who are living in this abject poverty. So that's enough about Disraeli for the moment. He later moved to Mayfair, and that is indeed where he died.